If someone told you that one of the most unexpected diplomatic encounters of the century didn't happen in Washington, Paris, or London, but in Ouagadougou, the modest capital in the heart of the dry Sahel, would you believe it? One morning in 2025, through the red dust and golden sun, a diplomatic car bearing the Liberian flag rolled along the dirt roads of Burkina Faso. It wasn't there to sign an agreement with the United Nations, nor to seek aid. It came to meet a man, a young captain once dismissed by the world, but now transforming the entire continent, Ibrahim Traoré. That story began quietly, yet behind it lay a silent political earthquake. One of America's closest allies, a nation born from the American dream itself, was now turning toward the Sahel, a region Western power maps once marked as an unstable zone. No future. Entry. What could make Liberia turn away from the Atlantic, seeking answers in the land of dust and wind? Liberia, Washington's first child on African soil, a country whose flag mirrors the stars and stripes, whose currency is tied to the US dollar, and for over a century has been seen as America's fragment in Africa. But when the screens went dark and the aid flow stopped, what remained? Hospitals without power, classrooms with tin roofs packed with children, roads drowned in water during the rains and choked with dust in the dry season. A nation born from freedom, yet never truly free. Meanwhile, a few hundred miles north, in a land once branded as hopeless, a quiet awakening was taking root. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of young Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was rewriting the meaning of sovereignty. They no longer waited for aid. They contributed. They defended. They generated their own power, and above all, they believed again that Africa can stand on its own 2 feet. That contrast became a silent tremor across the continent. As the Liberian convoy entered Ouagadougou, no one said it aloud, but everyone understood. This was more than a visit. It was the signal of a shift in the winds of history. Once a loyal student of Washington, Liberia was now seeking inspiration from a nation long dismissed as poor, even dangerous. From a place once told to obey, they were now learning to listen to themselves. They say that on that day, before stepping into the meeting room, the Liberian Minister of Foreign Affairs stood by the window, watching the Burkina flag flutter under the sunday. He whispered softly, "Perhaps it's time we relearn the meaning of freedom." That was not just a remark. It was the confession of a century of dependency and the opening line of a new era, where Africa begins to speak to itself no longer through the voices of others. From the Atlantic to the Sahel, a new road is opening, not paved with asphalt, but with belief. Not leading to palaces, but back to identity. And that journey begins with a simple, yet timeless question. Is this the first time in the 21st century that Africa is turning its own compass? As the sun slowly sets over Ouagadougou, the drums echo across the red sands, and from somewhere within the wind comes a whisper, sovereignty is not granted, it is claimed. End of. If you ever believe that revolutions begin only with gunfire, look to the Sahel, where another revolution is rising, through handshakes, steady eyes, and an unbreakable faith. Because sometimes, history doesn't need to be declared. It only needs a moment when a people dare to believe they can write their destiny themselves. Liberia, a name that once stirred the world's emotions, the land of liberty, is founded in the 19th century by freed Africans who had once been enslaved in America. They returned to their motherland with a dream to build a nation where freedom was no longer a privilege reserved for white men. But the tragedy was this: that very nation was built in the image of the same empire that had once enslaved them. From its constitution and political system to the uniforms in its schools, everything mirrored the United States. Even the flag bore a single star among red and white stripes, a quiet pledge of loyalty from child to parent. For over a century, Liberia became a miniature embassy of Washington on African soil. Every major decision, from its economic policy to its foreign direction, had to be reviewed by the other side of the Atlantic. But the price of protection is dependency. Beneath the surface of democracy and aid lay a fractured economy, one that survived on the American dollar, and a generation stripped of belief in itself. More than 60% of Liberia's people are under 25, yet 7 out of 10 have no stable work. A nation drowning in paradox. Aid without prosperity, freedom without sovereignty. In the 2020 seconds, while the world debated automation and AI, Monrovia still lived hour to hour on flickering power. 1/3 of the city fell into darkness every night. Children studied by candlelight. Patients waited all day for IV drips because the generators had failed. Meanwhile, the arteries of trade, the roads and ports remained in the hands of foreign corporations who profited immensely while locals struggled to survive. This dependency wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Generations grew up believing that as long as America helps, France supports, or the IMF approves, everything would be fine. No one noticed the cruel lesson hidden in those memorandums of assistance. When you get used to being rescued, you forget how to stand on your own. By 2025, disappointment had reached its breaking point. A new generation began to awaken. They no longer wished to live in Washington's shadow. They wanted a future written in Africa's own language, with hands, with sweat, with dignity. Questions began to echo in cafes, in classrooms, in student gatherings. Why must we always wait for others to help? If Burkina Faso can defend itself, why can't Liberia? And so, across the Atlantic coast, a new wind began to rise. Not the wind of aid, but the wind of awakening. The desire to reclaim the right to steer one's destiny, a right their ancestors had once bled for, but which time had quietly stolen away. From the narrow streets of Monrovia, those voices began to spread. Enough, they said. We've waited too long. And as those words carried northward on the wind toward the Sahel, another nation was ready to listen. Amid the blazing bands of golden sand in a land once called the Zone of Failure, the Sahel has begun to rewrite its destiny. Burkina Faso, a country with no coastline, few resources, and long dismissed by the West as a blind spot on the economic map, has become the epicenter of a silent revolution. No fireworks, no grand celebrations, only a young man rising amid the drums and the chants of worn-clothed, calloused-handed citizens, Ibrahim Traoré, the captain once deemed too young to lead. But from that very too young, a new kind of faith was born. In a brief speech in the heart of Ouagadougou Square, he said, "We have waited too long for the world to help us. Now is the time to help ourselves." That single sentence swept through the Sahel like a desert wind. In just 2 years, Burkina Faso transformed from an aid-dependent nation into a symbol of self-sovereignty. Foreign troops were expelled, local defense forces were reorganized, regions once held by terrorists were gradually reclaimed. Citizens, farmers, merchants, laborers pooled their savings into the Patriotic Support Fund, a model once mocked as naive. Yet within months, that fund raised over $600 million, all from the hands of the people themselves. This was no longer a story about war, it was a story about belief. Belief that Africa does not need permission to be strong. Belief that security cannot be imported. Belief that sovereignty is not granted, it is reclaimed. And alongside that, another quiet revolution took root, the solar energy uprising of the Sahel. In Donson, Nagriango, Pa and Zakuli, solar plants rose from the burning sands, sending the first streams of electricity into villages that had lived in darkness for generations. No one imagined that a country once crippled by power shortages could become a beacon of renewable energy. But here, it happened. The light didn't just shine on solar panels, it shone within people's hearts, proof that the Sahel could create its own light from its own Sunday. This success was not a miracle. It was the fruit of one simple, powerful truth. If you don't do it for yourself, no one will. And when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger joined hands to form the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, something profound shifted in Africa's collective consciousness. For the first time, nations were uniting not by colonial borders or foreign tongues, but by a shared ideal, self-determination. In faraway villages, people gave the movement a tender name, the awakening of the Red Earth. They generated their own power, and above all, they believed again that Africa can stand on its own 2 feet. That contrast became a silent tremor across the continent. As the Liberian convoy entered Ouagadougou, no one said it aloud, but everyone understood. This was more than a visit. It was the signal of a shift in the winds of history. Once a loyal student of Washington, Liberia was now seeking inspiration from a nation long dismissed as poor, even dangerous. Amid the darkness of poverty, they chose to ignite light with their own hands. And that is why, when Liberia looked north, it didn't just see a country, it saw a mirror. A living proof that freedom is not a promise from others, but an act of one's own making. In Ouagadougou, they say the Sahel no longer sleeps. And it's true, through the fierce winds and the scent of red earth, the Sahel has awakened. From a place once dismissed as a hopeless frontier, now rises the first voice of a new Africa, independent, proud, and forever unshakable. That morning, Ouagadougou saw no ceremonial reception, no red carpet, no honor guard. Just a modest wooden table, two small flags facing each other, and two men from two very different worlds, yet both carrying the same question in their hearts. How can Africa stop surviving on the mercy of others? Liberia's foreign minister, Sarah Nyanti, stepped into the small room where Captain Ibrahim Traoré awaited. There was no air conditioning, no polished walls, only the creak of an old fan and the aroma of black coffee rising from the table. Traoré stood and extended his hand. His eyes were not those of a soldier, they were the eyes of a man bearing the faith of an entire generation. "You didn't come here for aid, did you?" Traoré asked, his tone calm but sharp as steel. "No," Nyanti replied. "We came to learn how to stand tall." The conversation began plain, unadorned. No flowery diplomacy, no rehearsed protocol. Just two men speaking as brothers, as those who have both tasted hardship. Liberia came with 4 proposals, 4 bridges that could connect the Atlantic Ocean to the red sands of the Sahel. First proposal. Liberia sought the Sahel Alliance, AES's support for its rotating seat at the UN Security Council, not for prestige, but to prove that Africa could recognize its own, without needing the world's permission. Traoré smiled. "It's the first time I've heard a nation say, 'We want to be seen through African eyes.'" Second proposal. Liberia would open its 3 seaports, Monrovia, Buchanan, and Greenville, for AES nations to use, creating an Atlantic-Sahel corridor. A new transcontinental trade route, so the gold of Burkina, the uranium of Niger, and the oil of Mali could reach the sea without passing through foreign hands. Nyanti said, "If we don't connect ourselves, others will do it to control us." Third proposal. Liberia called for an AES Liberia Security Conference in Monrovia, a new center for military and anti-terror cooperation, entirely coordinated by Africans. No more waiting for orders from Paris or Washington. For the first time, Africa's security would be decided on African soil, by African hands. Fourth proposal, a bold breakthrough. To establish an autonomous African development bank, funded by citizens, the diaspora, and the continent's own resources, rather than by the IMF or the World Bank. "We have gold, we have oil, we have the sun," Nyanti said. "Why should we borrow money to use what already belongs to us?" In that moment, Traoré looked straight at his guest from across the Atlantic. No papers were signed, no rituals performed. Only silence, and within that silence, both men understood. This was no longer diplomacy. This was history. When the meeting ended, Nyanti stepped out onto the balcony, gazing over the low trees of Ouagadougou. The Sahel sun bathed his face, blurring the line between ocean and desert, between the old world and the new. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Perhaps for the first time in my life, I see Africa's future not far away, but right here." Just a modest wooden table, 2 small flags facing each other, and 2 men from 2 very different worlds, yet both carrying the same question in their hearts. How can Africa stop surviving on the mercy of others? Liberia's Foreign Minister Sarah Nyanti stepped into the small room where Captain Ibrahim Traoré awaited. There was no air conditioning, no polished walls, only the creak of an old fan and the aroma of black coffee rising from the table. Traoré stood and extended his hand, and between them an idea was born, the Atlantic-Sahel corridor. That idea appeared in a brief note that Minister Sarah Nyanti left on Ibrahim Traoré's desk. The first line read, "If we can connect the sea to the desert, we can connect all of Africa." It was no coincidence that Liberia proposed it. For decades, Sahel nations have paid dearly for their lack of access to the sea. The gold of Burkina Faso, the uranium of Niger, the oil of Mali, all forced to pass through foreign ports, blocked by taxes, political conditions, and the grip of global corporations. Each year, billions of dollars vanished on the road to the ocean, not because of nature, but because of dependence. The Atlantic-Sahel corridor was the answer. A transcontinental trade route designed, built, and managed by Africans themselves. No American flag, no EU label, no IMF conditions. Liberia would open its 3 main ports, Monrovia, Buchanan, and Greenville, to the AES nations. In return, the Sahel would supply energy, minerals, and agricultural products to the coast. A self-sustaining cycle began to take shape. Resources from the red soil of the Sahel flowed to the sea, while goods, fuel, and technology from the Atlantic returned inland. People began calling the project the bloodstream of the continent, not because it carried goods, but because it carried hope. Here, that day, neither of them knew that this quiet encounter would become a turning point for an entire continent, the beginning of a journey across oceans, across deserts, and beyond the long shadow of the past. From Monrovia to Ouagadougou spans more than 1,200 kilometers of distance, not just of geography, but of destiny. On one end, the sea open, salty, and weary from waiting for aid. On the other, the desert dry, harsh, but unyielding. A coalition of engineers from Burkina, Liberia, and Mali worked side by side to design the first integrated logistics line. Local private firms invested. Students volunteered to translate, to map, to plan. What was once dismissed as a fantasy was becoming a national strategy. Yet what surprised the world most was not the numbers or the blueprints, but the spirit. For the first time, a coastal nation and a landlocked one saw each other not as strong and weak, but as two parts of the same body breathing together. They didn't sign contracts to share profits, they signed to share faith. When the first freight train departed from Monrovia's port, heading toward the red sands of the Sahel, silence fell on both ends of the journey. Because everyone knew it wasn't just cargo moving, it was history in motion. From blue sea to red earth, from old sails to new steel rails, a continent was finding its heartbeat again. And within that heartbeat echoed a truth carried by every grain of sand, every breaking wave. We are no longer exporting resources, we are transporting our future. News of the meeting between Liberia and Burkina Faso spread faster than anyone expected. At first, it was just a few lines in the local press. But in the age of social media, no one needs television, just one image. Every container of gold, every freight car of produce was no longer a symbol of export, but a proof that Africa could feed itself. A radio analyst in Dakar once said, "If this corridor succeeds, it will keep many Western capitals awake at night." Because for the first time, Africa is saying, we can trade among ourselves. We don't need you anymore. On the ground, the plan moved forward. The Sahel Atlantic Railway began its surveys. Spontaneous discussion circles sprang up in cafes, on radio shows, in market stalls where people debated Africa's own path. For the first time in decades, young people weren't talking about going to America, France, or the UK. They were talking about going to Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey. Names once associated with poverty and war had become destinations of hope. A young economics student in Monrovia said during a campus forum, "If Burkina Faso can raise $600 million without the IMF, why can't we?" That question rang like a bell of awakening. No one laughed anymore when hearing the phrase economic sovereignty. No one dismissed self-reliance as a fantasy. They began studying how the Sahel did it. Community funds, local banks, technical cooperation between universities. Liberia would open its three main ports, Monrovia, Buchanan, and Greenville, to the AES nations. In return, the Sahel would supply energy, minerals, and agricultural products to the coast. A self-sustaining cycle began to take shape. Resources from the red soil of the Sahel flowed to the sea, while goods, fuel, and technology from the Atlantic returned inland. People began calling the project the bloodstream of the continent, not because it carried goods, but because it carried hope. Across the internet, hundreds of short videos appeared. Agriculture students in Ghana learning solar energy models from Burkina, law students in Nigeria re-examining mining contracts the Sahel way, youth groups in Senegal organizing AES Days discussions on autonomy, unity, and the role of young Africans in rebuilding the continent. The atmosphere felt like an unannounced spring, a spontaneous awakening that needed no manifesto, yet everyone could feel it. In Monrovia, graffiti appeared on walls, "Don't migrate, build." The slogans spread like wildfire, printed on t-shirts, painted on buses, chanted during peaceful marches. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré didn't say much. He simply sent out a short radio message broadcast across the Sahel. "We don't need recognition. When the youth begin to believe in themselves, the world will have no choice but to recognize us." A single photograph Traoré shaking hands with Minister Saranianti. two flags behind them, one red, gold, green, the other blue and white with a single star. That image swept across the continent like fire on dry grass, and from it, a movement began. At the University of Monrovia, students taped handwritten posters on walls. "We won't look for jobs, we'll create them." Online, hashtags like #Sahel Model, #Africa for Africans, and #Rise from Within became the rallying cries of a new awakening. Indeed, the power of this wave lay not in policy or resolutions, but in a shift of collective consciousness. From waiting, they moved to doing. From begging for opportunity, they began to create it. From believing in others, they started to believe in themselves. Monrovia, once quiet by night, now pulsed with song. Voices echoed down Tubman Boulevard. "We are not broken, we are building." No one organized it, no one led it, yet the whole city beat as one, the heartbeat of an Africa learning, at last, to beat for itself. That night, as the few electric lights still glowed over the capital, a young woman looked up at the sky and whispered to her friend, "If Burkina can do it, then so can we." And in her eyes shone not just hope, but the undeniable proof that a new generation of Africa has truly awakened. It didn't take long for the world to notice. Just days after Liberia announced its partnership with the Sahel Alliance, headlines from Washington, Paris, and Brussels began to echo across the airwaves. The anchors' voices were cold, repeating familiar phrases: populism, military alliance, regional threat. To them, the Sahel wasn't a symbol of self-determination, it was a spark of instability. But beneath those warnings, everyone knew what was truly at risk was not security, it was influence. In Faso, that message was like a spark thrown into a barrel of fuel, and it ignited a wave of hope. Tens of thousands of Liberian youths poured into the streets not to protest, but to celebrate possibility. They sang, waved AES flags, and chanted "Africa for Africans," a slogan once old, now burning with new life. A Western journalist observed, "This is no longer politics. It's a spiritual movement, a generation learning to love their own Africa." A young man standing in the crowd shouted, "If our freedom makes them afraid, it means we're moving in the right direction." Yet the real challenges didn't come from outside, they came from within. Inside Liberia, members of the elite tied to Western financial networks began to panic. They called the Sahel partnership reckless, impractical. Some officials quietly warned that defying the old order will leave us isolated. But the youth refused to listen. "We've been isolated for too long," they said. Isolated inside our own dependence. In Ouagadougou, Traoré understood the cost of independence better than anyone. He told his advisors, "We've won the first battle, the battle to choose for ourselves. But the second one will be harder, the battle to keep believing. Because building is harder than rising." The Sahel could defend itself, but sustaining its economy, schools, and hospitals would take time and unwavering will. Unity had to become action, not just a slogan. Meanwhile, skeptics in Europe began betting that the new alliance would collapse under internal strain. They believed a united Africa was still a fantasy. But what they failed to understand was this. For the first time, the people of the Sahel and Liberia were not fighting for profit or position, they were fighting for dignity. And dignity, once awakened, can never fall back asleep. The challenges remain: old debts, global pressure, lack of infrastructure, shortage of capital. Yet with every slow, steady step, something irreversible is moving forward. New roads are being built. Solar grids continue to light up. Youth assemblies keep meeting across the continent. For the first time in generations, Africa is not turning back. And amid all the pressure, one question echoes in every heart. Can we keep our faith when the light begins to flicker? The answer, perhaps, lies within them, the men and women who are rewriting what independence means, not the absence of enemies, but the absence of fear. As night fell over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stepped out onto a small balcony and looked southward. There lay Liberia distant, yet closer than ever. He said nothing at first, only breathed deeply, then turned to his aide and murmured, "The waves from the Atlantic have reached the Sahel. Now it's time for the winds of the Sahel to blow back to the sea." Those words sounded like a prayer, the beginning of a new cycle, when faith no longer flowed from north to south, but from Africa to Africa itself. In Monrovia, thousands gathered before Parliament Square. They carried no protest banners, only lights. Small lamps, charged by solar power, illuminating the street symbols of the new light they had learned from the Sahel. And as they stood together, voices rose in song, "We no longer wait, we begin." No one commanded, no one organized. Yet the whole city came alive like a festival of dawn. From rooftops, markets, and schools, one chorus filled the air, "Africa for Africans." The sight spread across the continent. In Lagos, people projected footage of the Liberia Sahel meeting onto building walls. In Accra, youth held a forum titled Sovereignty 2. In Kigali, students formed a study group on the Autonomous African Development Bank. A current of thought was rising, quiet, peaceful, unstoppable. The West watched, puzzled. Analysts debated, scholars dissected. But what they couldn't grasp was this. This was no longer politics, it was consciousness. A generation had seen its reflection in the mirror of the Sahel and realized that freedom is not a gift, it is a choice. Freedom is not being allowed to live, it is daring to live by your own identity. As the sun rose over the eastern Sahel, light swept across the red dunes. They said the wind that morning felt different, gentle but warm, because it carried something new, the belief that though the road ahead would be hard, no one could extinguish the fire that had been lit. That fire did not burn in palaces, nor did it belong to parliaments. It lived in the people's hands, in the eyes of Monrovia's youth, in the songs of Ouagadougou's children, in the hammer blows of Sahel workers raising power lines toward the sky. And Africa was being rebuilt, not with borrowed money, but with belief. And as you listen to these stories, perhaps you too can feel it. History is not something that happened. It is happening now. If you believe that Africa's light needs no permission to shine, if you believe that sovereignty is not a slogan but an action, if you believe a continent can rewrite its destiny, then type One Africa below this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to carry this spirit forward, the spirit of those who are turning belief into strength and strength into the future. Because one day, when the world asks, who awakened Africa? The answer will be, no one. Evoke ourselves,